fantastic.
Absolutely, that's fine. Hi everyone, nice to virtually meet you all. So I'm Ashley, I'm a genetic counsellor. I'm based in Sydney. I'll talk you through what a genetic counsellor does throughout my presentation. I guess the other thing that I'm doing at the moment is I'm actually doing a PhD in genetic counselling for motor neurone disease and also frontotemporal dementia. So this is certainly an area of work that I'm very interested in. I'm due to finish my PhD hopefully later this year. So I guess without further ado, what I might do is I'll just give you a quick outline of what I'm planning to present. Okay, so I've got a few things to talk about, and genetic counselling may not be something you've ever heard of. So I guess what I'd like to do first is go through a little bit about familial and sporadic MND and talk a bit more about familial MND, which and a bit about the underlying genetics too. And then I'll talk you through genetic testing that is available for MND and the genetic counselling that happens alongside the genetic testing. And then I'll walk you through a few example situations that might come up as a genetic counsellor, but also from a patient perspective and also from a relative perspective. And then I'll give you a quick rundown of my research project and ways to access some more information. And then I'm more than happy to answer any questions either at the end of the presentation, or if you wanted to speak to me separately as well, I'll add my details on the last screen. So you're certainly welcome to contact. So you probably know that most cases of MND are considered sporadic, meaning that we don't know the exact cause of why MND happened. There are lots of different theories about why it does happen, and a few kind of key ones might be about exposure to toxins or different infections throughout one's lifetime. We know that it's mostly an adult onset condition, so perhaps it's something that over a lifetime you might accumulate different exposures that could cause someone to be at increased risk. But overall, the causes are mostly unknown, and for most people with MND, we can't pinpoint exactly why they have developed the condition. But we do know that a small percentage of cases are familial, and that means that there's an underlying change in one's DNA which have caused the MND to happen. And this can be inherited and passed on from generation to generation. And what we see in cases or families where there is familial MND is that there might be multiple family members with MND or similar conditions. One of those conditions is frontotemporal dementia, which I'll talk a bit more about in the next slide. One thing to know is that with familial MND, similar to sporadic MND, we don't fully understand it. So we know that there are some families where it does seem to run in the family, but there's also people who have developed MND that don't particularly have a strong family history, and even still they might have an underlying genetic component to explain why this has happened. The other thing that's really hard about familial MND is that we're not very good at predicting how familial MND might affect a family. So within families with familial disease, we might see different family members who've developed disease at different ages or presented in different ways. So for example, one family member who may have developed weakness in their legs first, another who may have developed weakness in their speech. So it's certainly very variable, and we're not at a position now where we can easily predict, even if you do have familial MND, if you will develop disease and how that might look and when that might happen. One key thing to note and kind of remember throughout this presentation is that a small percentage of people who are believed to have sporadic MND will actually have familial MND. And what I mean by that is that when we look at people with MND, we can't, clinically they don't look any different, the familial and the sporadic cases. The presentation is the same, the weakness is the same, and it's not easy to determine who fits into the familial group and who fits into the sporadic group, unless we gather some clues from the family history or we do some genetic testing. So I'll talk you through some of the genetic testing in a few slides. Before I do, just to be clear, so we've got MND and frontotemporal dementia, which I've already mentioned. They're two quite different neurological conditions. So MND is commonly called ALS around other parts of the world, and you might see some of the figures that I use throughout this where they talk about ALS instead of MND. Frontotemporal dementia, instead of being like MND where there's progressive muscle weakness, it's changes in the brain that cause maybe changes in your behaviour, your personality, language or emotions. So it's quite different presentation to MND. What we do know is that these two conditions sit along a continuum, with MND on one side, FTD on the other. And we know that there are people who have MND who might absolutely have signs of frontotemporal dementia. There's also a percentage of people with MND who might have a few, subtle frontotemporal dementia-like signs, like changes in behaviour, personality, language or emotions. From a scientific perspective, we believe that both of these conditions have shared clinical, genetic and pathology features, and often they are talked about together more and more because we now understand that there are certain genes which might predispose someone to both MND and FTD at the same time. So this is a nice complex puzzle, and this is a great way of demonstrating to you how complex the genetics of MND and FTD are. So if we think about the continuum, on the blue end we've got the MND associated genes, on the yellow we've got the FTD associated genes, and in the middle we have genes associated with both MND and FTD. Some of the key genes in MND, which depending on what you've looked into, you may have read about, are SOD1, SOD1 on the blue end here. That is an MND only gene. And then we've also got C9orf72 here, which is an MND and FTD gene. So in families with a SOD1 familial MND, they might see multiple family members who have developed MND over their lifetime. In C9orf72 families, we will see family members where they may have developed MND, others may have developed FTD, others may have developed both MND and FTD at the same time. So I guess those are probably the two ones to focus on in the presentation today, but I guess I just wanted to highlight that there are a number of genes that are now known to be associated with these conditions. And on the side here, we've got a number of different, I guess, ways that these genes actually cause disease. So in looking at all of these things, I guess what I'm trying to explain is that the genetics is quite complex. So when we're thinking about ways to, I guess, target treatment and management for MND, we've got to take into account how these genes function and what they do to the cell when they aren't functioning well to inform treatments. If we look at a table of gene discovery, for most conditions, really discovering genes associated with conditions really only started in the 80s and 90s. And the first gene that was discovered in MND was SOD1 here in 1992, 1993. And a number of Australian families helped for that discovery to happen. And then if we move on up, we see this kind of exponential growth of gene discovery, and that's because the genetic technology has become better and we're able to more easily, I guess, identify genetic links between patients and families. C9orf72 is the big one. So if we are thinking about familial MND, maybe about 10% of familial MND is explained by SOD1, but about 40% is explained by C9orf72. So when we do offer genetic testing to patients, usually what happens is you might start by testing C9orf72, and then perhaps you might consider doing additional testing, which includes SOD1 and a bunch of these other genes as well, to determine whether there is an explanation for the MND in the family and I guess a reason for there being familial MND. So I guess that's the science behind it all. What I do as a genetic counsellor is I talk to people about genetic testing. And I guess what I wanted to focus most of the presentation on today is how genetic testing works and whether genetic testing might be useful or something to consider for anyone who's here today. So why is genetic testing potentially important? Well, there's two kind of areas. One's for the patient, the other for relatives. For the patient, if we were to identify that they had a SOD1 or a C9orf72 gene, or a mistake in one of those genes, a mutation, then we would have an explanation for why they developed disease. And that can be really powerful, of course. The thing that's tricky about it is that currently, even if we know that someone has an underlying genetic explanation for why they developed MND, it doesn't change their medical management. But there are possible treatment options available in future targeted to people with specific genes. And one of those examples has actually launched now in the last, say, 6 months or so in Australia. It's called the VALOR study. There's information about this on the MND Australia website. This is a phase 3 trial of a treatment that is targeted to people with a SOD, well, certain SOD1 genetic changes. So even though maybe now there aren't any potential immediate changes to medical management, it's very possible that genetic testing may be a part of routine care for patients with MND in the future, particularly if some patients would become eligible for trials or even treatment options that would be available to them based on their genetic predisposition that they carry. The other side of why genetic testing might be important is really for family members. So for relatives, it could help to give us clarity about what their risk of developing disease is in future. And if we do identify that there is a disease-causing genetic variant in one of these genes, like C9orf72 or SOD1, then there is a test available to other family members to determine whether they have inherited that same gene variant and therefore whether they are also at risk. Not everyone will want to choose to go through that, and I'll go through my example case. One of them is a person deciding about that testing, but it certainly provides the option for them to go ahead with that. The other thing is reproductive planning, so family planning options which help to prevent genetic changes being inherited from future generations. Of course, probably for anyone listening to this today, they might have different attitudes to these options, and that's the whole idea of why genetic counselling is important, because even though these options are there, they may not necessarily be right for everyone, and we know that not everyone decides to go ahead with testing as a patient. We know that not every relative will decide to go ahead with testing for themselves or as part of their family planning decision making. Okay, so in terms of what is involved, the practicalities of genetic testing, it's usually just a simple blood test, and you usually start genetic testing on a patient with MND because that's going to be the highest chance of finding something. We know the results of genetic testing can take a few months, and it does vary depending on where you are and which laboratory does it. It might be anything between 4 weeks and 6 months. Part of genetic testing, though, is a genetic counselling discussion, and the genetic counselling discussion might be something that's done, you know, from a neurologist or your primary doctor as part of your MND care, or it might be by a specialty service like a genetic counselling clinic. You may not have heard of genetic counselling, so I'll just quickly go through what genetic counselling is, and this is a kind of a key definition. It incorporates the following 4 things. So one is interpretation of family and medical histories. The second is education about the condition, support and resources, followed by counselling to promote informed choices and support to encourage the best possible adjustment. As you might see here, genetic testing is not a goal of genetic counselling. So it's very much up to the individual whether or not they proceed with genetic testing. If it is available, it's not always available for a number of different reasons. Now, these 4 items can be provided, as I said, from many different types of health professionals, but genetic counsellors like myself, and that's Rosie, my colleague at Macquarie University Clinic, we are trained to provide all 4 of these aspects. And I guess when we think about multidisciplinary MND care, we know that there are a range of different health professionals that might be a part of your care. It's possible that in the future, a genetic counsellor will be part of the MND clinic. So I guess that's important to keep in mind, that at the moment there are not always a genetic counsellor in an MND clinic. I think there's only 2 around Australia, but it's very possible that in future this might become a bit more routine. So I'm just going to run you through some examples of, there's David, a patient who has MND, and then there's also Ben, someone who has a relative who has familial MND. And just walk you through, I guess, what might be expected as part of the genetic testing process. And then I'll give you a quick rundown of my research, and then there'll be space to go through some questions as well. So if we just think about a hypothetical person, David, recently diagnosed with MND, and as part of his workup, the neurologist will take some personal medical history, but also take some family history as well. And I would not be surprised that as part of your workup, you would have been asked about family history too. So David explains that his father is aged 86, currently lives alone and is relatively well, and is adopted. So there's no further family history on his father's side that he knows of. His mother died young of a car accident in her 40s, and his maternal grandmother was wheelchair bound before she passed away in her 60s. He doesn't know why she was wheelchair bound. He does wonder whether maybe perhaps she did have some changes in her behaviour later in life, but it's very unclear. He doesn't have too much information. He's got 2 other brothers, a son and a daughter, and a wife as well. So perhaps the neurologist might think, well, could this be a familial MND family? I mean, there's no definite MND in the family, but could David's maternal grandmother potentially have had MND? I mean, it's possible. And could those changes in behaviour be frontotemporal dementia? That's also possible, but it is quite vague. The other side is obviously his father was adopted, so there's no other known family history there. So we don't know whether there is a stronger family history of MND or FTD on his father's side. It's just unknown. So David might send, the neurologist might send David to meet with a genetic counsellor or an equivalent person to have a further chat about the family history and gather some more information. So the genetic counsellor might draw a family tree like this. And as part of this, the genetic counsellor asks a bit more information of David, who reveals that his great uncle actually had a dementia of some type and doesn't have too much information about it, but it could, of course, help with clarifying his risk. Sometimes a genetic counsellor might also want to see if there's a way that we could track down some information. Medical records can be kept for a long time, and there may also be some clues on a death certificate as well of what someone may have developed at an older age. And it's possible that the genetic counsellor might see about clarifying or confirming some of the information in the family, which will help to clarify how likely it is that David has familial disease or not. So I guess once this happens, then the genetic counsellor might have a chat to David about the pros and cons of proceeding with testing. And there are pros and cons, and I guess I want to walk you through some of them now. So if we were to identify a DNA change or a disease-causing variant, as I said before, it could provide an explanation for David's MND and possible access to treatment trials, but also information for family members regarding their risks and options for predictive genetic testing and family planning. But there are some cons of that as well. It can provide information, but there's no current options to manage that risk. So it's very possible in the future there will be trials available for people who are at risk, but at the moment there aren't any changes, and all we're left with is information for relatives to say they're at risk and no real options to know what to do with it. There's also some emotional implications of testing. David might feel guilty about this risk for other family members, particularly for his children, or he or other family members may become quite worried or anxious about the risk. And the other thing is it currently doesn't change his management. So if we think about, well, what about if no genetic change is detected? Well, it could provide some reassurance to David regarding risks to relatives. And what I mean by that is if we did test David and we did not find that he had a genetic change, perhaps the likelihood that he had familial MND would be decreased, because there isn't really any other clues in the family to suggest there's definitely MND or FTD there. And of course there are cons of that it could not completely rule out an inherited risk for David and his family. And in general, a possible con of proceeding with testing is that it is a lot of time to wait for a result, and that can be an anxiety-provoking time for patients as well as their families. So David's options are he can proceed with testing, he can decline testing, or he can defer testing. And certainly from a genetic counsellor's perspective, there's no right or wrong decision here. David's got to make a decision that's right for him and his family. So if he proceeds with testing, it's possible, there's three possible results. Either we find a genetic change, and that helps to clarify why MND happened in him, and also clarify that there is a risk to other family members and testing available to them. We might find that there's no genetic change detected, and in that case then we would perhaps feel a little bit reassured that David didn't have familial MND, and therefore his other family members will not be so much at risk. The other thing is that we might find a change of uncertain significance. Genetic testing isn't perfect, and that means that sometimes we do testing and we find a change that we don't fully understand just yet. And that's an uncertainty, unfortunately, with the genetic testing process. So David could also decline testing. So if he doesn't have testing, then there may or may not be an inherited risk in the family, and testing's unavailable for his relatives, but he's made an informed decision not to proceed. Another option for people who decline testing is deferring testing, and that is arranging storage of DNA for future use. Sometimes that is something that people might want to consider doing as part of, I guess, the decision making. They don't want to have to think or deal with a genetic testing result, but perhaps having that information available for other family members in future could be useful. So what, as part of the genetic counselling, David would be encouraged to speak to his family, including his wife and his children, and perhaps other family members as well, like his aunt or any cousins. And what David discovers is that his children have different viewpoints. So his daughter is interested and his son doesn't want to know. So his daughter is interested because she is planning a family in a few years' time and is interested to know about her risk and what that might mean for her future. It might change how she thinks about her plans, including family planning. But for David's son, who doesn't want to know, he already has had his family. It wouldn't change any of his life plans, so he doesn't really see the point of knowing. So what does David decide to do? Well, it probably doesn't really matter what David decides to do because it's such an individual choice. And it's important to know that genetic counselling supports that this is certainly an individual and family decision. And there's no right or wrong decision to be made about the options here. David should feel supported throughout from his care team and genetic counselling team if that's relevant. And genetic counsellors are there to kind of help facilitate or, help with the discussion with the family, and also support David and his family throughout this process. If we think about it from someone who has a family history but has not developed disease themselves, it's a slightly different way of thinking. So just to run through a bit of an example here. So Ben is 30 years old, with a history of MND on his mother's side. So his mother had MND at age 60 and his grandfather had MND at age 52 and may have also had FTD. 5 years ago, his mother was found to have a C9orf72 gene expansion. So his mother agreed to proceed with testing, and now we know that Ben has a 50% chance of inheriting this genetic change. And that means there's a 50% chance of potentially being at high risk of developing MND or FTD in his future. That also means there's 50% chance of not inheriting it and not being considered an increased risk of developing MND or FTD in the future. So Ben is at a point where he's hoping to start a family soon, and he's interested in considering predictive genetic testing. So he gets referred to a genetic counselling service to talk through whether or not to proceed with testing for himself. And the testing will either tell him whether he has or has not inherited this C9orf72 genetic change, and therefore whether he is or isn't at increased chance of developing MND or FTD in his lifetime. So part of the discussions, sorry, the light's just gone out in this room. Part of the discussions here would be around just ensuring Ben is informed about the genetic testing available and the implications of testing, and also that he's considered the possible impacts of testing on himself and others. So you might explore how aware he is of MND and FTD, how much exposure he's had to the condition. You know, if he was there for his mother during her care, he would understand more about the condition than someone who hasn't really had too much experience yet. You'd also explain to Ben that the C9orf72 genetic change is there, and that means that he could be at increased risk of both MND or FTD in his future, but it's variable. And based on our current knowledge, we cannot predict if, when, or how he will be affected by these diseases in future. Its inheritance pattern is autosomal dominant, meaning that there's a 50% chance that Ben has inherited it from his parent. And it also means that if he has children, there's a 50% chance with each child that he will pass it on. Kind of like flipping a coin, really. The counsellor might explore the possible impacts of testing on himself and his family. Think about like psychological implications. Will Ben feel anxious if he's found to be positive? How will this impact on how he goes day to day? What about, you know, does he think that genetic testing will change aspects of his life? Would he consider, say, working differently, planning a family differently, going on more holidays? How does he imagine that genetic testing is going to impact him, both in a practical way, but also in a psychological way as well? How is he feeling now? Is he finding the uncertainty of not knowing quite hard? And sometimes for some people, the uncertainty can be unbearable, and actually knowing that they do have the genetic change can be better than knowing that they are at risk of having the genetic change from a psychological perspective. There's also insurance implications of genetic testing, which we would discuss. So in Australia, genetic testing does not impact on private health insurance, but other insurances like life and income protection. Someone's genetic testing results can have implications on whether you can apply for a new policy or upgrade a policy. Current policies are guaranteed renewable. And there's currently, I guess, a rule that is only related to policies that are greater than $500,000. And then there's also reproductive options. Would Ben consider doing anything differently if he was planning a family and knew that he was at risk of passing on this gene? Some people might consider going through IVF, for example, to prevent passing this genetic change on. Others would do nothing differently and just know that their children might be at risk, but of course that it's such a variable condition, and it's an adult onset condition that will not affect their children growing up. It will be something that would affect them as adults, and who knows what the technology and management might be like then. So I guess the other thing is exploring the timing of testing. Why now? Is he worried about symptoms? Is it mainly about family planning? Is he feeling pressured or not pressured by other family members? Kind of just exploring those dynamics with him as well. So what might happen is we would encourage Ben to spend some time considering his options. Speak to his partner, to other family members, to get their input and their perspective on whether or not genetic testing might be right for him. Certainly not everyone wants to speak to their family about this decision either, so it's really just being guided by the person in front of you. He might be interested in being reviewed by a neurologist because he is worried about symptoms, or he might benefit from meeting with a psychiatrist or psychologist to help work through the challenges of living with the uncertainty of having this in your family. So a genetic counsellor would support Ben by providing him with information that's relevant to him, supporting him to communicate with others, reviewing the support available, providing counselling throughout this whole process, and supporting him to make an informed decision regarding whether to proceed with testing. And from our point of view, it's completely his choice what he decides to proceed with. So I guess that's very a brief rundown of what might be expected as part of genetic counselling for MND. I'm just going to go through a few small slides about my research. So as I said, the PhD project should be finished towards the end of this year. Why am I interested in studying this? Well, because we know that genetic testing is emerging in the care of patients with MND and FTD, and that's because of these potential future treatment options available for people with genetic forms of MND. So it might mean that genetic testing will become routine and part of your workup for disease, so that if we know that someone has an underlying genetic change, then this is the best management option available for them. Genetic counselling is required as part of this genetic testing process because it is quite complicated and there's a lot to consider. Currently in Australia, even within states, there are no consistent approaches for how genetic counselling is conducted, and there's very little research on this topic. I'm interested because I've been working with patients and families with MND for a while now, since 2015 at the Macquarie University MND clinic, and it's something that I think could be improved upon. So that's the whole idea, is to provide a consensus statement or a kind of a model of care for the best practice genetic counselling and testing for MND genes, and hope for some consistency so that depending on where you are in Australia, that you at least get you know, a minimum standard model of care provided, so that you go through the genetic testing process smoothly, as do other family members as well. So I'm doing 4 different projects as part of the PhD. The first 2 are literature reviews, quite detailed literature reviews. One is on just looking at other similar conditions. So late onset neurodegenerative diseases, MND and FTD fit in to this category. Other genetic diseases that fit in as well are Huntington's disease. There's a lot of literature in the area of Huntington's disease. And then my other area was looking at, in particular, genetic counselling and testing for MND and FTD and what has been reported so far. So what did I find in the literature reviews? That genetic counselling practice from around the world varied and are informed by much local kind of aspects, laws and resources, and the availability of different health providers. In Australia, a lot of the genetic counselling for MND is provided by either a genetic counsellor or clinical geneticist as part of a genetics clinic, or a neurologist who's managing the care of MND patients. There's a focus on client and family-centred approaches to genetic counselling. Traditionally, genetic counselling may have been quite rigid in how you were to conduct the genetic counselling process. You know, step 1, speak about this, step 2, speak about this. But now there is certainly a focus on being more targeted to the needs of the patient and their family. And what we identified is that health providers have limited time and resources, but they need to ensure that clients can be safely and effectively counselled. And perhaps there might be other options to ensure that could be the case, like more resources for health professionals and patients, or the involvement of genetic counsellors as part of the team. We know that the decision to undergo testing or counselling is based on personal, familial so family and practical factors, including lived experience of disease. So, for example, someone with a very strong family history of MND might think quite differently to someone who, there's a single case of MND in the family. Future areas of research which I hope to address in my next two studies are looking at the role and use of different health providers, understanding more about patient and relative preferences for testing and counselling, because actually there hasn't been too much looked into in this area, and also developing minimum discussion points or guidelines for test counselling. So the next two studies involve input from various stakeholders. So we've got this qualitative interview study and this Delphi survey study. I'm currently in the middle of the qualitative interview study, where I'm planning to explore experiences of diagnostic genetic testing and counselling in Australia and gain suggestions to inform the care of future families. I'm currently recruiting individuals who have experienced genetic counselling, and basically anyone who's been offered genetic testing as part of their care. I'm interested in speaking to them about what was good and what was not so good about their experience and what they would have as suggestions in the future. I'm conducting interviews by telephone. I can do email typed interviews or instant messaging. And I also have video conference like this on Zoom. And for some people, they're doing the interviews one-on-one, and for others it's, as a pair. So for example, siblings together or a couple together being interviewed about their experience. I'm currently advertising through the MND associations as well as FTD equivalent associations. So you may have already seen my post around. If you are interested, you are more than welcome to contact me to find out some more information about the study. I'm certainly keen to get as many viewpoints as possible before moving into my next study, which will be formally starting in March. So this is a Delphi survey, which I'd never heard of before I started this PhD, but essentially the idea of the Delphi is to help with identifying areas of consensus, as well as conflict on the ideal components of genetic counselling for diagnostic testing. So the diagnostic testing means testing of the patient. And what I'm doing is a survey online with 10 to 20 participants who are either health providers in genetics, health providers from outside of genetics like neurologists, and also I'm getting input from consumers, so patients, their family members, and also members of the MND associations to ask what they think about the ideal components of genetic counselling. The way that the Delphi works is you send a round of surveys, and then I analyse the data, and then I come back to everyone and say, these are the results of the first survey, what do you think? And the whole idea is that you end up with a list of consensus items and conflict items on genetic counselling. If you are interested in finding out more, once again, please contact me, and I'm certainly happy to talk about anything further at the end of this. So as I said, the whole idea of this project is to use these 4 small studies to inform a model of care or consensus statement on how to provide genetic counselling for patients and families. Just to summarise, we believe that genetic testing can provide an answer only for a small proportion of patients with MND. And there are pros and cons of proceeding with testing, both for the patient as well as their relatives. Genetic testing results currently do not change patients' management, but certainly may in the near future. I understand that this VALOR study at the moment is only currently happening in Sydney. It's very possible this year that it may be in other sites as well. And there's also other studies for other genetic susceptibilities too. Genetic testing results may inform risk for other relatives, and it may provide options to access more testing. And genetic counsellors, our role is to support the patient and their family through the testing process, including decision making, communication with others, support and adjustment to a result. So if you are in a position where you have undergone genetic testing and maybe not met with a genetic counsellor, you may wish to perhaps engage with one if you think they might be helpful. Genetic counselling is not your typical counselling as well. So certainly any questions or concerns, I've just listed a few resources here. So of course you can ask a question now or contact me. Speak to your care team. Pictured here is the care team I work in. That's Professor Dominic Rowe in the middle at Macquarie University Clinic and Research Centre. There's a very detailed fact sheet on familial MND and genetic testing. Sorry, that's on the MND Australia website. The Centre for Genetics Education, genetics.edu.au, they provide a list of clinics that you could contact if you were after some more information. And for people who have MND, familial MND, they may be interested in the MND Decision Tools website. There is a detailed, I guess, tool to work through as a decision helper for people who do have familial MND to decide about genetic testing. I've said a lot, so I whizzed through that quite fast, Stacey and everyone. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions now. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Ashley. I have unmuted those that I could unmute. If you already muted yourself, I can't do that. You need to do it yourself. But I am keen to hear what questions everyone's got for Ashley.
Ashley, how do you approach a relative who comes, who's looked at the internet or whatever and found out about genetic testing, but the patient and other family members are not yet interested, but this person wants to go ahead? How do you counsel them, given the fact that they may get a result that gives information that other people don't want?
Yeah, great question. I think that's a really tricky one. And when we do speak to anyone about this, we know that there are going to be impacts of genetic testing, not necessarily just on the person in front of us, but also on other family members. For some people who are interested and, you know, no other family members are at risk, they may consider undergoing their own genetic testing to determine whether or not they have inherited a gene. It's a bit more complicated because, you know, if we think about the example of Ben, for example, we know that there's a genetic change found in his family and we know the explanation here. But for family members who there just appears to be something, if we do a genetic test and it's negative, it's not a 100% answer. So for some people it's useful and something to consider, but usually what we try to do is you know, encourage some family discussion first and then hope that we can come up with a option that you know, works for people. And sometimes that might be that you know, there's an agreement that someone in the family does not discuss their result with someone else in the family who doesn't want to know. So it gets pretty tricky and complex, and I guess that's why it's important to have someone who's kind of thought through all of the potential implications. Does that help?
Oh, yes, just, you know, I mean, the tricky part is going to come in the future when there may be specific treatment options that are important to start early or whatever, where somebody saying they don't want to know can be quite detrimental to other family members.
Absolutely, and I think that's probably why now it's probably like now they should have really started looking into this area of research much earlier, because now we're at a point where that's coming.
Jimmy, did you want to ask your question? We've got it via chat.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Yeah, great.
Okay, lovely. Look, I just wanted to know that because I have the mutated gene of the C9orf72 and I've got one biological child, they have not been tested yet. And I think he's going to wait until I pass before he does. I have a feeling that's going to happen. But this is what I'm curious about now. If he's found that negative, that he doesn't have the gene, I mean, yeehaw, that's great, awesome. But is there a possibility that when he has a child or children, that they could get it?
Pretty much no. So really, the way that the testing works is if your son does do the test, even when, if it's negative, then he can't pass that change on to his children, and it's kind of where it stops. Yeah, which is, yeah, absolutely. And that's often why people might do testing as well, because they're hoping that if it is negative, then that's where it ends and they can, not have to worry about this. So, the hope that there would be a negative result is enough to go ahead.
Oh, that's awesome, because it's quite prolific through my family. My father was one of 9. Elder sister, MND, died, had 2 kids, both MND. One died, one took their own life because they saw their sister and mother go through it. And as for the other 8, 4 of them, MND, 2 of them, symptoms, and one's almost gone. The other one's symptoms have just started. And then you've got my generation of cousins where there's a truckload have got them, and then there's me.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
It's really prolific, and it's all C9ORF72 passed down from one to another to another to another. So I'm hoping someone puts a stop to it somewhere.
That's absolutely right. And, based on the way that, that it's passed on, it's 50-50 that he would have inherited it from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for that.
And that's all right.
Ashley, are you, obviously if it's 50-50 if the gene is inherited, do you know what the chances are of that gene then? Like you said, it's an increased risk of MND, but do you know what the chances are of that becoming MND?
Yeah, good question. It's quite variable. So the early studies, if we just talk about C9orf72, and then I'll talk about SOD1. So C9orf72, the early studies suggested that the chances were almost 100%. But there's probably been some more recent studies which perhaps suggest it might be lower than that. And to be honest, I couldn't tell you a number because I don't trust the numbers, just based on the different families we've seen personally. So we know that there are some C9orf72 families, unlike Jimmy's family, where there is not too much in the way of family history, and some people seem to have got the gene but not developed any disease. And then for SOD1, it's quite variable as well. So most of the genes are close to 100%, but some of them are much lower. And it depends on the specific genetic change identified in the family.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? No? I have another one if nobody else wants to jump in. So I was wondering if, obviously the genetic testing is optional, but you also talked about the fact that there is a number of the genes that have not yet been identified. Is it valuable for future identification of those if people do undergo the DNA testing now?
It's probably more valuable being involved in, studies. So like biobanks. So I know that there's a few teams in Queensland who are collecting samples from people with both sporadic and familial, like Project Mine, which you might have more information about locally, Stacey. But I guess those are probably the areas where research will be improved. When we personally do genetic testing from a clinical rather than research perspective, we're doing it simply for the family. So that's, it could be potentially useful for future research, but the labs that we use, they're not using that data to inform research. It's more just for the family.
Are they saving the sample for studies in the future that may be more informative?
Yeah, so anytime, so through the research and also through the clinical genetic testing, DNA samples are stored pretty much indefinitely. And what that means is that if there is more, technology, so for example, we find a really common, another MND gene that we hadn't heard about yet, then we can go back and look at samples that have been collected in the past, and that can help research obviously, and also clinical, so help the family as well.
One last question from me, actually. I know I said I only had one, but one more. So if you are aware of people within your family that had MND or likely had MND, but they didn't undergo the testing themselves, what are your options in terms of identifying whether you have those?
Like if you are someone who doesn't have MND, but you have a family history? Yeah. So if that person is still around and we could arrange genetic testing on them, that would probably be the ideal. But as I mentioned before, there's it is a decision and it's not always available, either because the person's no longer around or they're just not interested in testing. Mm-hmm. What you could consider doing is seeking genetic counselling. So that will provide a complete review of your family history and help to determine the likelihood of there being an underlying genetic change there. And for those people, some of them may wish to still consider testing, even though there are limitations to this testing. So it's the ideal test is on someone who does have MND or FTD. But if they're not available, you can consider doing testing on someone who doesn't have disease yet. It just means that if we don't find that there is an underlying genetic change, it doesn't really give us too much information, because it might just be that the technology's not picked it up, or maybe other family members have a gene change that's not being passed on. So it's just a bit more complicated and a bit more to think through, but it's certainly not an uncommon question that comes up when we are seeing patients and their families. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, any last questions from anyone else?
I've got one. Ashley, I spoke with my neurologist about testing, and he didn't seem to think it was worth the cost. I probably got, sporadic, so there are, as far as we know, no family members. But of course, I'm 76, so my family members would have been killed off before they got MND. So we don't know for sure. So is it still worth me getting the test? And could I bypass my neurologist and get the test?
Great question. So firstly, in terms of the costs, so we know that genetic testing does cost money. So it could be anywhere between a few $100s to $1,000 to $2,000, depending on the type of test you do, the laboratory use, etc. Many genetics clinics have a pool of money that they can use for testing. So some people can access publicly funded genetic testing through going through a genetic counselling clinic. What I understand about Queensland is that perhaps people like you, Peter, who appear to have apparently sporadic disease, may not be able to access publicly funded genetic testing for the moment. But you could consider being referred to a clinic to undergo testing yourself. So there are private genetics clinics, for example, that you could see to arrange testing and pay for testing out of pocket.
Right.
For someone like you who's expressed an interest, I guess sometimes the benefits of having the test to say that there's nothing there can be really reassuring. So you might not necessarily be doing it because you want to have, you want to find something, but if you can be reassured that there's nothing there, then that can be really valuable for you and other family members who are around as well. So I would say that if you are interested, then it could be something worth doing.
Right.
If someone does have likely sporadic disease, so there are a small proportion of those people who will have familial, but to put it into context, it might be about 3 to 5%. So I guess if you're going into the genetic testing process knowing that the chances of finding something are relatively low, but still not zero, then I think you're making a decision that's right for you about whether to proceed.
Yeah, so it was a matter of curiosity, really. Because I spent my childhood in the West Indies, and I was probably exposed to a lot of DDT. And I'm just wondering whether that is the likely source of my MND. But if there was also a genetic change, that would sort of, because my understanding is you need quite a few of these sort of impacts on your body, and then you get MND. And then other people with less impacts will not get it, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. I guess if someone has... Oh, sorry, you go, Peter.
I'll take it up with the neurologist when I see him again. Yeah.
Yes, do. And my experience through meeting with patients, but also through my research, is that different neurologists have very different points of view on this topic. Yeah. So if you don't have much luck talking to your neurologist, you could have a chat to your GP as well. Who could refer you.
Yeah, good idea. Thanks for that.
Not a problem.
All right. Any other last questions? No? Okay, then we will let you go. Ashley, thank you again so much for your presentation. Obviously, Ashley's details were in that presentation if any of you are interested in taking part in her research. If you can't find them or just want a quicker way to connect, then obviously you can always email me. I'll put you in touch. Okay?
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Take care. Bye.